Hey guys, tonight we're slipping under the heavy, clanking world of medieval knights. Those shiny, brave warriors who somehow managed to avoid baths like the plague, even though they wore metal suits that probably made them sweat enough for two people. Imagine trudging through muddy fields, the clang of steel all around, your helmet trapping every scent you'd rather forget. You probably won't survive the stench, but trust me, the knights barely did either. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop your location and local time in the comments so I know who's falling asleep with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might think a knight's armor was a gleaming fortress of cleanliness, but really, it was more like a sweaty prison you couldn't escape from. Bathing? Forget it. Clean water was precious, and scrubbing down in the middle of a battlefield was not only impractical, it was dangerous. Armored knights spent weeks, sometimes months on campaigns, marching through mud, blood, and who knows what else. Their armor was heavy and hot, turning their bodies into slow-cooking roasts. The heat, sweat, and grime had nowhere to go, trapped inside their suits of steel. Historians still argue whether knights' aversion to bathing was due more to superstition. Some believed water opened the pores to disease, or just plain inconvenience. Either way, the result was the same. Knights who rarely bathed, smelling like a mix of leather, sweat, and the occasional hint of something worse. And here's a quirky detail. Some knights tried to mask the smell with rose water or perfumed oils. Expensive luxuries that didn't quite solve the problem, but made them feel a little less like walking garbage dumps. So, as you imagine yourself under that heavy helmet, sweat dripping down, itchy chainmail pressing into your skin, remember, you're in good company. The stink was part of the job. You're still wrapped in that heavy suit, but now let's take a step back and look at what made knights so oddly attached to their grimy armor, and why it was basically their second skin. You might picture armor as a flashy costume, but for knights, it was a literal lifeline. They wore it from dawn till dusk, through battles, muddy marches, and feasts alike. Taking it off was a chore that involved an entire team, often requiring hours. So, bathing while wearing it? Not happening. On top of that, bathing itself wasn't the relaxing spa moment you might imagine. Medieval bathhouses were few and far between, and often shared spaces, sometimes with dubious hygiene standards. The idea of peeling off all that heavy gear just to wade into a crowded tub wasn't very appealing. Plus, after a long day on the road or battlefield, knights were exhausted, and the last thing they wanted was to wrestle off armor, soak, and put it all back on. Imagine trying to slip back into a sweaty, rust-prone suit after a soak. That would be like putting on a soggy wool blanket and hoping for the best. Here's a fun twist. Knights sometimes used a technique called dry bathing. No, not the latest TikTok trend, but rubbing down with cloths soaked in vinegar or herbal infusions to cleanse themselves without water. It wasn't exactly the same as a real bath, but it helped reduce the smell and prevent infections. Well, as much as they could. Of course, there were exceptions. Nobler knights and royalty might enjoy occasional baths in heated wooden tubs, often scented with herbs. But even then, the armor stayed put for days on end, so the stench was an inevitable byproduct. Historians still argue whether knights truly avoided water because they believed it weakened their health, or if it was simply about practicality and survival in a harsh, muddy world. Maybe it was a bit of both. After all, you don't want to get sick when you're about to joust for your life. So, while knights weren't exactly rolling in cleanliness, they managed to keep their armor, and themselves, functioning enough to survive brutal battles and medieval life's messiness. Now, picture yourself after a long day in that metal cocoon, armored from head to toe, the sun baking down, sweat pooling in places you didn't even know could sweat. Your legs ache, your back stiff, and you're pretty sure your helmet smells like a barnyard. Yet, despite this, medieval knights rarely stripped off their armor to bathe or clean themselves thoroughly. It wasn't just laziness, it was partly about survival, and partly about the armor itself. The shiny metal wasn't as shiny as it looks in the movies. In reality, knights spent hours polishing it to prevent rust. But rust was the real enemy, far worse than grime or stink. Water and moisture were a knight's arch nemesis because they would cause the steel plates and chainmail to corrode. Once rust set in, armor lost its protective edge and became brittle, turning a lifesaver into a death trap. So, knights developed a sort of armor hygiene that sounds bizarre today. Instead of water, they used oils and fats, often animal-based, to keep the metal supple and rust-free. Yes, imagine rubbing greasy pig fat all over your armor every few days. It wasn't the most pleasant ritual, but it worked. The downside? This greasiness mixed with sweat and dirt, creating its own unique aroma, a mix of musk and, well, medieval funk. Here's a quirky fact. Some knights even rubbed their armor with sand or fine ash to scrub away stubborn grime. Think of it like medieval exfoliation, but without the spa music or cucumber slices on your eyes. Historians still argue whether this practice helped more with maintenance or simply masked the less glamorous realities of knightly hygiene. Was it more about protecting metal or pretending to be clean enough to kiss royalty? Probably a bit of both. So, while you might imagine knights as heroic, shiny crusaders, the truth is they lived and breathed a less glamorous reality. One filled with grease, rust, and a level of stink you definitely wouldn't want to compete with in a closed helmet. So, you're still wrapped in that suit of armor, but let's step back and imagine the day-to-day realities that made bathing even more impossible for knights. Picture the medieval battlefield: mud, sweat, blood, and a never-ending parade of dirt and grime. Not exactly spa conditions. Once a campaign started, knights and soldiers could be on the move for weeks or even months. There was no time or place for a nice soak in the river or a bathhouse. To make matters worse, many battles were fought in environments where clean water was scarce. Rivers and wells were often polluted, especially during sieges or long marches. Bathing in such water might have done more harm than good, leading to infections or illness. So, knights had to find other ways to stay somewhat clean, or at least less miserable. You might be surprised to learn that some knights used herbal infusions and scented cloths as makeshift wipes to freshen up a bit. Lavender, rosemary, and even mint were popular. Not quite a shower, but better than nothing. And remember that dry bathing we talked about earlier? This was a common practice, especially when water was off limits or dangerous to use. Here's a fun but gross tidbit. Knights sometimes lined their helmets with cloth soaked in vinegar or other acidic liquids to kill bacteria and reduce odor. Imagine the sting if you had to wear that all day. Historians still argue whether knights avoided water primarily because of superstition. Some believed washing opened the skin's pores to disease, or purely because of practical concerns. It might be a mix. Either way, the result was the same. Medieval knights stayed grimy, sweaty, and a little rank. Even after battles, knights had to tend to wounds and armor, and cleaning injuries with dirty water was risky. The whole hygiene situation was a catch-22. Cleaning was needed, but dangerous. So, as you let your mind wander in this medieval haze, remember that knights' reluctance to bathe was less about laziness and more about surviving in a tough, gritty world where clean water was a luxury, not a given. Now, you're probably wondering, if knights rarely bathed, how on earth did they manage the smell? The truth is, they didn't. Not really. Body odor was just part of life. But that didn't mean they gave up on trying to mask it. In fact, knights had a whole arsenal of clever, if somewhat strange, tricks to cover the stink. One popular method was layering clothing under the armor. Knights wore a padded garment called a gambeson, basically a thick quilted jacket that soaked up sweat and acted as a cushion. These gambesons could be washed separately, which helped keep things marginally fresher. But between the gambeson and the armor, the sweat and smell often got trapped. To combat this, knights used scented powders and pomanders, small containers filled with fragrant herbs and spices like cinnamon, cloves, and ambergris, which they would carry or even sew into their clothing. Think of it as medieval air freshener, worn on the body. Here's a quirky detail. Some knights supposedly wore small pouches of dried lavender or rosemary inside their helmets to keep the smell at bay. Of course, this was far from foolproof. One can only imagine the mixed scents swirling inside a helmet after a day's fight. Historians still argue whether these scent tactics actually worked, or if they were just hopeful attempts to ignore the inevitable odor. It's clear, though, that knights understood the importance of smelling respectable in social and courtly settings. Even if on the battlefield, all bets were off. And get this, knights were known to use crocodile dung as sunscreen. Yes, you heard that right. Ancient practices sometimes found their way into medieval medicine and hygiene routines, proving just how inventive and desperate people could get when it came to self-care. So, despite their lack of baths, knights did try to navigate the delicate balance between battlefield funk and courtly charm. A messy business, but one that added to the colorful lore surrounding these armored warriors. By now, you're probably picturing knights living in a cloud of sweat, dirt, and medieval musk, barely able to peel off their armor for a proper wash. But what about their helmets? Those metal cages sealed around their heads must have been a nightmare for cleanliness and smell. Turns out, helmets were often the smelliest piece of the whole kit. Inside, helmets could trap heat and sweat, making the wearer feel like they were inside a boiling pot. Some knights added padding inside helmets to cushion their heads and absorb sweat. This padding, called an arming cap or coif, was usually made from linen or wool. It was removable and washable, but cleaning it wasn't a daily ritual. Imagine being inside a sweaty sock for hours. That's basically what a knight's head felt like. Helmet hygiene was so tricky that some knights avoided wearing full-face helmets for long periods, opting instead for open-face designs or helmets with visors they could lift for fresh air when off the battlefield. But when battle was on, the helmet stayed locked down tight, trapping all those smells inside. Here's an interesting tidbit. Some knights used scented cloths soaked in vinegar or rosewater inside their helmets to mask the odor. Others would burn incense nearby to help freshen the air in their living quarters, sort of an early air purifier, if you will. Historians still debate how often helmets were cleaned and whether knights' discomfort led to innovations in helmet design. Some evidence suggests that ventilation holes and better padding came from a desire to improve hygiene and comfort, not just protection. So, while helmets protected knights from swords and arrows, they also created a personal sauna experience, where sweat and smell were locked in tight. It's a small but revealing glimpse into the less glamorous side of medieval chivalry. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the less obvious reasons why knights avoided bathing. And it wasn't just about armor or dirt. In medieval times, people believed that water and washing could actually be dangerous to health. Yeah, you heard that right. The idea of opening your pores by bathing was thought to invite illness straight into your body. Medical knowledge was, shall we say, a bit sketchy back then. The dominant theory, called the humoral system, suggested that your health depended on balancing 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Washing too much was believed to disrupt this balance, so washing less was considered safer, especially during colder months. On top of that, water itself was often contaminated. Bathing in a river or well wasn't exactly the cleanest experience. So, knights and regular folks alike preferred to skip the bath to avoid catching diseases, which, ironically, might have made them sicker. Here's a quirky medieval hygiene fact. In some places, people would wear the same clothes for weeks and simply air them out rather than washing. Clothes were often considered the real source of cleanliness, more important than bathing the body itself. Historians still argue how much superstition versus practicality influenced bathing habits. Some say knights were simply following the medical advice of the time, while others suggest it was more about convenience and the difficulties of bathing in armor. So, when you picture knights skipping their baths, remember, it wasn't just laziness or smell. It was a complicated mix of medical beliefs, practical challenges, and the realities of medieval life. As you drift deeper into this medieval world, it's worth exploring how knights managed personal hygiene outside of bathing. Remember, knights weren't just warriors. They were also expected to maintain a certain standard of cleanliness to fit into noble society, at least when off the battlefield. One of the main hygiene tools was the cloth wipe, or toilet paper, of the era, which was often just a piece of linen or wool. Yes, it sounds crude, but it was effective enough for the time. Knights would carry these cloths to clean themselves, sometimes dipping them in water or herbal infusions for extra freshness. Not exactly a spa day, but better than nothing. And speaking of hands, knights were particular about cleaning their fingers before meals. Medieval dining was a hands-on affair after all. They'd often have a servant pour scented water over their hands or offer fragrant towels for wiping. This was more about manners than hygiene, but it shows that some cleanliness mattered in social settings. Here's a fun tidbit. Some knights kept small pouches of scented herbs, not only for their bodies, but also to freshen their horses. Horses could get pretty ripe after long rides, so knights believed keeping their mounts smelling pleasant reflected well on their own reputation. Historians still debate how consistently these hygiene practices were followed. Some suggest it was mostly for show, more about appearances at court than real cleanliness, while others argue that knights took pride in staying as clean as possible given their circumstances. So, even if knights rarely bathed, they had clever ways to keep up appearances and feel a bit fresher, proving that personal hygiene was never entirely ignored, just adapted to their gritty lifestyle. Now, let's talk about the aftermath of battle, a sweaty, dirty, and exhausting mess. When knights finally removed their armor after a fight or a long day of training, you might expect a glorious bath to follow. Spoiler alert, it usually didn't. Instead, knights often resorted to dry cleaning methods. They'd brush off dirt, wipe sweat with cloths, and sometimes rub their bodies with oils or perfumes to mask odors. Baths were rare, partly because of the time it took to disassemble the armor, and partly because bathing facilities weren't always accessible. Medical treatments for battle wounds were another reason to avoid water. Water could irritate injuries or introduce infection. So, knights often used herbal salves and poultices to clean wounds, believing these remedies were more effective than water. This cautious approach to hygiene was a double-edged sword, helpful in some cases, dangerous in others. Here's a quirky detail. Some medieval knights believed that bathing after battle could weaken their warrior spirit or invite bad luck. Superstition ran deep in those times, and physical toughness was as much about mental resilience as it was about muscles. Historians still argue whether knights' aversion to bathing after combat was mainly superstition, medical advice, or simple practicality. Regardless, the image of a knight immediately jumping into a bubbling bath after battle is mostly fantasy. So, when you think about those shiny suits of armor, remember they were less about sparkle and more about surviving tough, sweaty, smelly realities. And the post-battle cleanup was just as complicated as the fight itself. Finally, let's wander into the social side of knightly hygiene. You might think knights, being nobles and warriors, had access to all the luxuries of medieval life, including regular baths, but the reality was more complicated. Public bathhouses existed in medieval Europe, often large, steamy rooms where people bathed together, socialized, and sometimes got into trouble. These bathhouses were popular, but also controversial. Religious authorities sometimes condemned them as hotbeds of immoral behavior. So, knights had to navigate social norms and religious expectations when it came to bathing. Sometimes knights preferred private baths in castles, if available. These baths were heated wooden tubs or stone basins, filled with water warmed by fires. But heating large amounts of water was a laborious process, not to mention expensive. So, baths were more of an occasional luxury than a routine practice. Here's a fun little historical surprise. Some knights used scented oils and perfumes more often than baths, layering on fragrances to mask the odor of long days in armor. Floral scents, herbs, and even exotic spices from the East made their way into knightly grooming kits. Historians still debate how frequently knights actually bathed in these settings. Some suggest that bathing was seasonal, happening mostly in warmer months or special occasions, while others argue it was rare and sporadic at best. So, despite the sparkle of their armor, knights' bathing habits were a patchwork of social pressures, religious beliefs, practical challenges, and personal preferences, making the knight in shining armor image a bit more complex than you'd expect.